Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and re-enchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and re-enchanting. Welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. I am your hostess, Reverend Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Lisa Colón DeLay, author of The Wild Land Within, and perhaps better known for her podcast, Spark My Muse, which I very much recommend, which engages with contemplation and mystical thinking and the inner life for Christians and other folks, and really everything else that sparks her muse, which I very much appreciate the breadth of it. So welcome, Lisa. Delighted to have you with us today.
It's so great to speak with you again, Sara. Thank you for having me.
We met at the BYU Faith and Spiritual Podcasters Summit. I'm going to be doing a series, several, you'll probably be hearing more about that because I've been doing several podcasts with other podcasters, which is quite fun. And Lisa and I've already had a few conversations. And I was really intrigued with your book, The Wild Land Within. I'm referring to it as the inner landscape because that's a term that several other friends and colleagues and I have started using, looking at the interiority and the soul and the journeys and the landscapes within ourselves, which are deeply intertwined with external, physical, social, ecological landscapes. And it's rich and it's fun. So as I was reading the book and going through it, it is sort of mapping out this inner landscape terrain, drawing largely on your own experience, but also very much mystical writers, particularly from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, within the Christian tradition. Like this is very solidly within the Christian tradition, Eastern and Western Christian traditions. And I I drew a map and then I sent the map to Lisa like a few hours before this podcast is being recorded. So we're both like excited about the map right now.
Very. I love the little bunny ears of the desert hare.
Thank you. I'm really proud of the desert hare. The map will be available so people know what we're talking about. We'll have it up on the show notes. And so I was kind of mapping out the different like parts that you were mapping out of individuals, and really more talking about the individual and the communal, but they're connected in our landscapes. I just thought is really fun. And I'm like reminded of like this tremendous work that humans do of like, how do we talk about and visualize and diagram and describe the invisible worlds within us that are both completely alone, completely things that we experience by ourselves, and yet also things that we all experience together.
Exactly.
And how do we find words for that? And it's inevitable, right? And it's not just this map of who God is, right? It's not just about the transcendent and the immanent spirit. It's also how do we talk about the invisible dynamics within us that shape our lives? And so I appreciated the many ways in which you're trying to do that. And you're not just using someone else's rubric. You're not just using, a psychologist or theologians or priests like something that's already been written. You're drawing upon multiple things that have been written,
Hmm.
and saying, hey, look, like, what if we put several of these pieces together?
Right.
What does that look like?
Right. Well, with the piece that I think sometimes doesn't happen in spiritual formation books, as it were, maybe in the Christian tradition, is this element of trauma. How do
Mm,
we
mm, mm,
process trauma? What does that look like in the interior space? Especially in, I'm more familiar growing up in evangelical circles, and it's sort of
mm,
like, in a way, it's like, well, once you have that conversion experience, uh, the bad stuff gets better. I think that's kind of it's naive, but it's also maybe a spiritual bypassing. And I think that to actually heal and not transmit that to others, our unwellness or our woundedness, we have to actually dig deep and find out what's happened or what's wrong and what hurts, and then it's this unseen land. It doesn't, um, it is not visual, so you do need to rely on metaphor, and yet it's so real. It's the realest thing there is, as these invisible parts of ourselves that you can't weigh, you can't measure, but they're about our experiences and our memories, our ambitions, hopes, fears. And if you ask anybody about their childhood experiences or about their trauma or about their joys, no one's going to tell you, oh, that's not real. You can't measure that. You can't prove that. you know, all this uncharted territory is very real, and the most rational people who who might set that aside might be the toughest people to deal with.
mm. And so I was so like amused when you first started saying that, because it's like I feel like in the last 10 years, definitely trauma is like in so many conversations
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
that I hear.
Right.
Um, I'm sure many of the conversations you hear, you've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, which is
Yeah.
part of what you bring to everything you do. And a lot of very kind of like sweet, intimate conversations with people. Um, and like I'm kind of like, so when you say that trauma awareness is not part of spiritual formation, do you think that's changing right now?
It definitely is changing. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's people out there like Audie Culver. Um,
Mm.
she's written. Oh man, of course I'm going to draw blanks now. But I can send a book
Yeah,
list or
sure.
recommendations of books, and she talks a lot about it's somatic things. I think what's happened, it's a Western imposition that we are kind of like heads that go from room to room, and not thinking about our bodies. We're sort of in our heads, and this is I think a product of the Enlightenment, where we have these separate spheres. We think of the spiritual as separate from the work life or the personal life or the romantic life or whatever. And this infiltrates our way of understanding faith or spirituality, and painful things too. So it's like, well, that's a thing in my past or whatever. And it's not to say this is true in Christian tradition or really a lot of traditions that um, are religious in total. But I think it's a modern Enlightenment imposition.
When I think about some of the mind body split, I also trace it. I mean, we can trace it obviously to Greco-Roman thought as well, but um, within the Western Christian tradition,
Right.
or as it intersects with Western Christianity, although it shifts during the Middle Ages, like some of that isn't as carried, or it kind of changes, or has particular flavor in the Middle Ages, which then changes in the I think visibly or clearly changes the Enlightenment. But when I think about the history of colonization, which is
Hmm.
a good 1 or 2 centuries, starts at least 1 or 2 centuries before the Enlightenment, it's I see very, very deeply that in order to be a colonizer, you
Right.
have to split
Hmm.
like your heart from your head and your body from your
Hmm.
head. Like in order to enact the act of
Hmm.
colonization, in order to enact violence, you have to
Exactly. Yeah.
you have to split yourself, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
before you can. split other people.
Right. It's also it's a willingness to, well, I think there's a lot that has to do with dehumanizing someone. If you decide somebody's not human like you, that's a
Mhm.
split, obviously. But I don't know if it's a mind body split or necessarily a mind heart split. It's a false dichotomy for sure. But there's a lot of violence that can be done if you just decide a group for whatever reason, based on their looks, based on their family of origin, where geography, whatever, that they're not as human. They don't get as much rights. They don't get the privileges. They don't deserve an education, whatever it is,
Mm,
or they're another gender, right?
mm,
Um,
mhm,
that one is still really prevalent. You know, we're seeing some of these echoes pop up now, even in our time, people talking about taking away a woman's right to vote.
mm,
Like, what splits are happening there? Um, yeah, there's a lot of refusing to look at reality, I think, in our own humanity.
in our shared humanity.
Oh, yeah. Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which really just lands right where you start the book in many ways, which is that our internal landscape, our internal sense of ourselves is who we are, is really, really shaped. You talk about these kind of you talk about like the whole inner landscape as like this weather system.
Uh,
Um, as the landscape and the weather is deeply shaped by the climate. It is, using this metaphorically.
hmm.
Um, so the climate that we have, and you name um, many of the splits within Christianity, including the mind-body split within Western Christianity,
Right.
um, uh, distinguishing that from Eastern and Orthodox and Coptic Christianity, which does
Hmm.
not have that same type of splits.
Hmm.
But within Western Christianity, ideas of crime and punishment and ideas of, or like ideas and impacts of self and other as exasperated and continually enacted through colonization.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm just, yeah. So I'm wondering if you can talk like how do you see these different big cultural pieces influencing? Kind of tease out a little bit. How
Hmm.
do these big cultural pieces influence in one's interiority?
Right. As I was writing the book, of course, this mirrors somewhat of my journey too, as most books do for people, unless you're writing like strictly history, strictly something. But for me, it was somewhat of a reflection of my own processing and my own understanding of what are cultural influencers, unconscious influencers, and that
Mm,
has to do with, how I grew up. I grew up as a pastor's kid, but I also grew up at first on the island of Puerto Rico, which is non-white, um, as a dominant culture. It's not white-centered, although it is a colonially oppressed place, and that completely obscures every single thing. However, I did realize when I came to the States that certain people are preferred, and it really, really stood out who is automatically considered, I don't even, just not preferred for the most benign way I can put it, but it has very, very nefarious things to it too, like who's assumed to have done something wrong, or who is
mm,
assumed to be, um, for instance, wearing tight clothes when you're a skinny white girl versus wearing just well-fitting clothes when you're a curvy woman who is, or a young woman who is a black girl. Those are, people are punished routinely way, way more, and it's because they don't have preferred bodies at a certain age, or whatever. But those things really stood out to me, and these are all hidden influencers that teach us about ourselves, that teach us about others, and I just wanted people to get a sense, like, we're not just investigating our inner worlds, we're investigating all these hidden cultural influencers. And ones that influence the way we think of gender, the ones that think of other, as you mentioned already. There's a lot of them in there, and we don't approach anything in a neutral way.
And that influences how we see ourselves.
For sure. And the thing about climate, so these cultural influencers I describe in the book as creating a certain internal climate. So maybe that, for just the sake of argument, maybe the climate in your internal weather system is full of weather. Perhaps it's hot and humid, but there's violent storms that come through. And then, of course, I describe these weather patterns as the 8 afflicting thoughts that Evagrius, the Desert Father, spoke about, but he didn't speak about them as sins. Those came later as the 7 deadly sins, and they got moralized. But what Evagrius was talking about was afflicting thoughts, these things that will bother us and pop up. They're totally normal and human, and they'll happen. So it's some of them that we're familiar with, like wrath and lust and gluttony. And then there's other ones that we're not as familiar with, like acedia, which is kind of a restlessness and a kind of spiritual boredom in a way. And it makes us want to just bounce from one thing to the next without digging too deep. And there's despondency, which is, it's not and this can be confused sometimes with depression. Is this the same as sadness and depression? But it is really like a spiritual despondency of hopelessness and the opposite of spiritual joy. And so many of us fall into that, and it's not judgment. It's just like, yeah, that's going to happen. It's coming. It might be in your weather system. It might happen more to you than something like wrath. Wrath might not happen. Anger might not happen as much, but maybe for you, you're going to keep heading into certain types of weather. And if you know about it ahead of time, you can really sort of prepare. There's certain spiritual practices that help, in a way, build your strength for withstanding some of that.
Mm-hmm. I wrote in the little map that I drew, I made those as like gusts of wind coming
Yeah,
through the landscape.
I
Like
love
the
that.
vainglory and the wrath and the
Yeah,
acedia and the dejection.
right.
Um, and it's true, like some of these are the um as you're saying, like much of this comes from Evagrius. Evagrius, is that how you say his name?
Evagrius. Evagrius.
Evagrius.
Hmm.
They're coming from Evagrius. And so tell us a little bit about this character for people who are less familiar with him.
Well, he's so interesting that I'm writing my second book, which is almost done. It'll be out in 2026. That's my little shameless plug. I expanded my whole next book based on him because he's such a fascinating character. He's one of the Desert Fathers, and so I decided I want to write their stories. I want to write more of the stories of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, who usually get left out. We don't realize there's so many wise women, men and women both went to them to be taught, and there was a period of time in the desert where up to about,
What time period are we talking about?
yeah, it's the 300s to the 600s CE, and this was a time when there was, just prior to this, there was the last really horrible persecution of Christians. There were 2 emperors in particular who really did the smackdown. There was about, in the course of just a couple years, in the area, especially in Egypt, there were about 3,500 tortured and killed Christians. And so some of these people fled out of fleeing persecution, but there was just a couple people doing that. Then what happened was this strange thing where Constantine basically makes it legal to practice Christianity in 313. And all of a sudden, the pressure eases off and you can be a Christian. And then slowly, he co-opts Christianity for power in the empire. It becomes nationalized. Christianity becomes national. And by a century later, it's not just getting immersed in there, but it's the endorsed religion, and then you actually can be killed for not being a Christian. It goes completely the other way. As it becomes corrupted, some devout people are like, what the heck is going on? Because all of a sudden the wealthy are getting involved in the cleric system and moving up, and it's another way to gain power and control and wealth. So things start going awry, and at this point, in the just a few people in the late 200s, but then really began in earnest in the mid 300s, and then for the next few hundred years. Now, at the point where there's a lot of like marauders coming through that area, it dwindles off. But even today, there's several hundred monastics in the desert now, and there's still the same enclaves and areas where they lived. It's incredible to go still see them. So Evagrius was one of these desert fathers who actually came from an archbishop status in Constantinople, the head of the I should say the capital of the Roman Empire at the time. And he actually escapes, which I'm not going to reveal all the reasons why. It was a very sordid love affair situation, and he finds himself in the desert, choosing to go. But he's incredibly intelligent and incredibly educated. He begins writing a lot of things down, doing translation work, writing some of the sayings from other wise mothers and fathers, but also writing things down as guidance for people coming to the desert. What is going to bother these young spiritual seekers, these novices? And he's like, oh, there's stuff coming your way. First, you're going to be celibate, so yeah, you're going to want to have sex. That's coming, that's, and I'm the same way, and he's like, the other thing is you've left behind, like, if you've left behind a good menu at home of some kind, out here it's just the basics. You're gonna wish you were fat and happy. That he just kind of is warning them like a gentle guide, and not saying, oh, you screwed up with lust, oh, you screwed up with gluttony, go repent, go do your penance. He's leading them much more in a preventative way, and showing them how to pray, and showing them how to do the ascetic life in a way that will help them the most, and encourage them the most.
And were most of the people coming from North Africa? Like, where were they? Where were people coming from?
They were sort of coming from a few different places. Syria, coming down to Egypt, and then they were coming out of Alexandria, out of Rome, some of the major cities, but also some of the little villages around, like the upper delta region of Egypt. There were also people coming in from Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Palestine. They were sort of coming from a lot of places sort of nearby, even as far as Spain.
A lot of work to get there at that time. Like,
right, it's a walk. Yeah. The other thing is they were trying to be in the middle of nowhere, so it would take about 3 days to get there from like the nearest larger town. Usually some of these places took a while to get there because they wanted to be away from people. They wanted to be away from civilization. They'd make their own city there. And there were hermits who lived, like, there's two different ways to think about it. There were hermits, and they lived like very isolated. They couldn't see anybody else or hear anybody else. But usually once a week they'd come back to a community who was actually usually supporting them with food or with what their needs were. And they would come back for church services, the divine liturgy, and sometimes they would also take that time to speak to someone as their spiritual mentor. There was a lot of guidance, a lot of spiritual guidance happening. And then there were communities that were proto-monastic. They weren't quite monastic in like the tradition of the Benedictines or something. That it predates all of that. But these were communities, and then they would live in what they call cells, and cells is this term that was pulled into our day, and penitentiary into our day, because the idea was we'll reform prisoners by putting them in cells so they can think about what they've done and do penance. But it turned into a warehouse situation for us. But and these days,
this turned into a lot more punishment than that. Yeah.
this was willing, you were willingly going. Obviously, there were two, in that case, it would be two people to a cell, either men or women. They divided them up by gender. But there were some women who would dress as men and sneak in because you weren't going to be harassed or by suitors there because people were celibate. Women would go in sometimes dressed in men's clothing, and they would have a vow of silence, but people would assume sometimes, well, they were eunuchs, maybe that's why they couldn't grow facial hair. And so there were a number of women who were in male communities, and they didn't know they were women until their deaths, and they buried them. They got them ready for burial. It's kind of a fascinating, not, kind of, it kind of breaks the binary there in a way, but there were also women communities as well.
This sounds like very much like a massive social and ecological and spiritual experiment. With a, and it would have been what we now would think of as sounds like a very multi-ethnic and multiracial community.
Yeah, and it really race wasn't the modern convention it is now, but there were certainly ethnicities that were very diverse. And it was an entire movement that it's so massive, and I know so many people who've never even heard of it. I mean, there were times when I'd say it's like the 500s and 600s, and people were flocking to the desert, not to live there necessarily, but to visit some of these people, just to ask for wisdom. And they were on their way on pilgrimage to go to the Holy Land. And so they'd stop in Syria, they'd stop in Egypt, and these monastic communities, and they'd ask for a word or a blessing or a healing from one of the abbas or ahamas. Maybe they'd stay there for a while because they weren't like bouncing around. They were walking everywhere, right? Or they were traveling maybe by camel or something, but they weren't hurrying along. So these pilgrimages would take 2 to 3 months to do. So they would say sometimes rivers of pilgrims were coming to these places, and it was just a massive endeavor in many ways. And then there were stylites. I don't know if, see, this will be in my book, but there were stylites this fad came up of these people who were what are called pillar dwelling hermits. And they would stay on top of a very small pillar for years. And it became a tourist trap. It was like, these are amazing people to write about, but it was one of those things where, like, what are they doing? They might be 50 feet high on a platform on top of a mountain, so you could literally see them for hours as you walked along. You'd see them for hours, and it was like these were wonder workers. They would come to them and ask for prayers, or just to marvel at them, even if they didn't, believe, or if they didn't know why they were up there. But it was a really amazing time in history, and yeah, I'm excited to write about. And Evagrius was one of those people that struggled mightily with all the afflicting thoughts, because he came from such a privileged life, a cushy life. And then eventually he became someone who was just incredibly admired for his humility, his righteousness, his wisdom and good advice. So it was John Cassian who wrote down all the lessons from Evagrius, then took it back to the West. And from there, that's how the monastic movement in Europe began. Which was thousands and thousands of monasteries all throughout Europe.
So tell us a little bit, like, when you're reading Evagrius. When you're reading Evagrius, like, what do you read in it that speaks to where you see people today? Like, you live in rural community in Pennsylvania, in the middle of America. Like,
right.
When you look back in time and read his writings and engage with his writings, like, what do you hear in him that speaks to you about the everyday people in your community and the voices you speak to?
Mm.
the contemporary voices you speak to around the world today?
Well, in some ways, it's probably goes without saying that me and Evagrius have pretty much nothing in common in most respects, right? Like, pretty much nothing in common in a way. Um, you know, like I'm married, I have kids, you know, I like have technology. Like there's 300 things I could probably list how we're different. Um, on the other hand, he is like to me like a spiritual guide and mentor who is to me like an unforced. He has these unforced rhythms. Um, he's not really. He seems like a guide who would be a pleasure to follow, not somebody
Mm,
who's really hard driving, you know, just somebody who you would really, really love to spend an afternoon with or something like that. His pace is slow, and for me, he slows me down as I read him, and I want to be more considerate of my
mm,
inner world and my like where am I directing my thoughts? Are my thoughts directed in selfish ways, or are they directed toward the virtues essentially, or doing good and doing good to others, that sort of thing? And so he kind of is this gentle but firm reminder about the good life, um, about living a virtuous life, and not a virtuous life in a way like to get brownie points or something like that, but like where you really enjoy other people and other people enjoy you, if that makes any
mhm,
sense. That's
mhm,
how he speaks to me. Like he doesn't seem like a harsh guide. He's very much like one of the nice things about these communities is that nobody's above anybody else. If people came from wealth, they gave up their wealth and they used it in service of other people to feed the poor or to care for the sick or whatever. And even though they might have come from having hundreds and hundreds of slaves, they began to serve. And they may have never served before, it would only have been served. And Evagrius may have had slaves, or he certainly could have afforded to pay people to take care of his needs as well. But he became a servant too. And it's this equality, and there's no, even for when they'd have mass or something like that, or whatever it was for the divine liturgy, they would bring a priest in from the outside to come in and do that for them. They wouldn't put anybody else above them to do special services or anything. They were just all considered, even though they would call each other Abba or Amma, father and mother, they were supposed to treat each other like brothers and sisters as equals. There's just something really beautiful about the lack of pretension, because Evagrius once came from, like I said, super, super educated, top of, you know, he was hanging out with the emperor at the council of, at the Nicene Council. He was about as high as you get. Um, and yet he comes down and just wants a humble life. He gives it all up. He doesn't want it anymore. It's worth nothing to him. You know, there's something really beautiful about that.
mm, mhm, mhm. And is that, are those like the, like when you're describing it, I'm like hearing what you're saying, like are those the teachings that really keep you within Christianity?
Mm.
Is that the kind of hope of what the good life will be, can be?
Hmm. I think I I'm within the I'm within the scope of Christianity, largely see it as my native tongue, but I
Mm,
don't, and I see myself as a Christian, um, but I also really see myself more as a follower of Jesus, like Jesus is my Jedi master or something. But I don't think of God as a Christian.
mm,
I don't. I am interested in the God beyond that God, the God beyond most gods. And I think a lot of us, including myself, we have little gods. We have little demigods that we act are like God. So, like in most religious expressions, even you can pick it out in songs and things like that too. Whoever it is we're singing to is this little god. It's a smaller thing. And I think I'm just more mystical in that way, that for some people that's going to make certain Christians maybe uncomfortable. They'll be like, "Oh, you're not Orthodox." I'm not uncomfortable with it because I have this presence of God sense with me. I have a sense of the presence of God. And so I'm not really concerned with other people's categories. However,
Mhm.
I'm fine to be associated with Christians so long as so long as they're not hateful, awful people. um, but the tradition of Christianity is marred with horrendous things, horribly horrendous things, and some bright spots. But it's like, I think the thing is now the common trend is deconstructing and unconverting and stuff like that. I don't really sense a desire to do that, but I also kind of understand why people would have trouble with Christians, and I totally get it. And there's people I've talked to who've really enjoyed speaking with atheists, and they'll say, "Well, God can't exist because of this," and I'll say, "Yeah, exactly." Um, yeah, I don't believe in that God either. Like that God you don't believe in, same as me. I mean, I hate that God as well. Like, but it's also, I guess there's more nuance in my approach, and so I don't have a problem finding wisdom in other traditions. And
And did the Desert Fathers lean into self-defining themselves as Christian? I'm just curious. I don't actually
they
know.
definitely did. Yes, they
Yeah.
were definitely Christians. And but the thing is about Eastern spirituality at the time is uh, so different than how we see it now. It's like spirituality just oozed into every single thing. So it's not something like that you just try on.
Mm.
It's so infused in the air. It's so everywhere. And so Christians,
And there's a lack of that mind-body split, and there's in a way that it's very different for how we think of Western Christianity today. And I think
right,
it's worth, like bringing
right,
back like that this is a Coptic Christian, right? Like the Desert Fathers
yes,
are in some ways, I
Coptic
don't know,
Orthodox, yes,
it's a Coptic Orthodox
mhm,
tradition.
right,
It's not it's not some of the other Christian traditions, even though it
mhm,
deeply influences like subsequent monastic traditions in Western Christianity for sure.
right.
Uh,
Uh,
yeah, and like what is it about that Coptic Orthodox tradition that might be really helpful for us to remember because it might have faded into the background of our thought.
hmm. Well, there's Coptics today as well. Like my friend Phoebe Farag Mikhail is someone who has helped inform this book that I'm writing now.
Mhm.
And if it wasn't for her input, the non-European, she's Egyptian, the non-European input, there would be some kind of glaring gaps. But she'll say, don't just say Coptic, say Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, because there is sometimes this thing that comes from Eastern Orthodox, and Eastern Orthodox are typically, not always, but generally, Eastern Orthodox are essentially white Eastern Orthodox. Then Oriental and Coptic Orthodox tend to be the brown Orthodox. And that actually matters because we don't necessarily think of it because I'm like for me, I'm out of the Protestant tradition. I have no idea. They split ages ago. Like the Coptics split over some kind of dual nature of Christ thing back in like 450 AD. And it was a minor thing, but it was like that we think of now in a way. But then they wouldn't fellowship with each other at that point, so that they kind of, it's a tree that split kind of early on. Um, then there's the Chalcedonian Orthodox, and they had a Council of Chalcedonia, and this is way before the Eastern split with the Western, which was in 1000 AD. This is long before that. That's when the Roman Pope was, made in the Roman Catholics went one way and the Eastern went the other way. That was in 1000 AD. So this is really like way early on. The Coptic Orthodox say Well, Mark the apostle founded our church. That was in 40 AD. That's as early as it goes, you know. Like they have pictures of them that have been drawn, you know. It's like, oh, that's really early. I just think that we're not, for me as a Protestant, I'm like, I'm not getting it. I'm not getting it. Um, and so I think the best thing to understand is that we're a lot of times superimposing some of our thoughts about Christianity on this really ancient form of Christianity that is actually nothing like our culture, and not like our experience. We've never experienced anything like the Coptics experience their services. It's totally, totally different. Um, that's okay. It's part of the history, and it's fine. But it's just really, really different. Um, I think it's really cool, but if I went into a Coptic Orthodox service, I'd be completely lost. They would be, it wouldn't be in English. It would be in, it depends what their liturgy would be in. It might be in Syriac. It might be in, you know, something else. And it just has been like that forever and ever and ever. So, you know, so it is really fascinating to go that far back. But I think that thankfully a lot of things have been translated, but not nearly what would be nice to have translated. There's so much wisdom from that Eastern side, or that Oriental and Coptic side, that have just never been translated into English. And I don't think that necessarily the desire is there, because the other side is favored among this part of the world. So yeah, but to me, these are my forebearers, my fathers and mothers, my spiritual fathers and mothers. And so there's just a lot to take in, a lot to slowly absorb. What they would say, a spiritual seeker would go into the desert and they'd say, Father or Mother, give me a word so I can live. And that was like, kind of, give me a little nugget of wisdom, and I'm going to just sit with that and meditate and pray about it and really consider that. But it would usually be for that specific person. It wouldn't be just general.
Give like an example of that.
Well, Evagrius goes early on. He goes into the desert. He's got all this stuff going on with him because he's trying to find his way. And he goes to someone called Macarius the Younger. There's two Macariuses at the time. So one is called the Younger. And he says, you know, give me a word that I might live. And Macarius, I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something along the lines of, I know you have everything figured out. I know I don't. But one thing you can try is to really rid yourself of self-righteousness and become humble. And basically, Evagrius goes like, he's like blown away, and he goes, well, every time I go to him, he just like basically says, I'm just like rocked, because he kind of drops a mic drop on him. You know, he gives him a mic drop, and he's like, boom. What he was basically saying was, you're arrogant SOB. Like, you come from all this money and you're so smart. And he was just telling him, like, get over yourself. Get over yourself. And but he wasn't telling him in a way that would like discourage him. He was just like, you're going to do a lot better when you can set the self-righteousness aside. And so, you know, Evagrius just took that for a long time. Then after a long time of sitting with a word, and you could go back to your father or mother and ask for another word, or ask for clarifying question. So the spiritual direction was just such a huge component. It wasn't like therapy where you go when you have a problem. It was just regular guidance through every part of life, whether you were in the desert or not. Like you would have a spiritual father or mother, just religiously speaking, in the church. And that's something that is unusual now. It's almost a luxury to have a spiritual director now. It's something like, you know, for a lot of people, that's actually a luxury.
Well, and it's not even, people don't even know that it's possible. Like often when I do spiritual direction work with people, I have to start with from the beginning of like, how is this not coaching?
Right, yeah. Or not therapy, and Hmm.
not therapy, it's not coaching, it's not this, it's not that, because we've kind of
Yeah.
lost. And like, yeah, sometimes we might have sometimes a short conversation is all you need. And
Mm.
sometimes you need to talk a lot. And yeah, and it's a really it's I'm appreciating also, like, it's even as the even as that particular version of Coptic Orthodox is so different and so far
Hmm.
from where we sit today.
Hmm.
That word, as they say, of, get off your high horse and be a little bit less arrogant. That's remains very good advice for many
Yeah.
people. And
Yeah.
as much as we have so much in our world has changed in the last 2 millennia,
Hmm.
and yet so much of these interior maps, our words are different. We don't use some of like the words like vainglory that he uses.
Hmm.
We don't really have that word quite that way anymore. It doesn't quite exist anymore.
Right.
But um, but that doesn't mean experience, I can figure out what it means. It's not hard for me to figure out what that experience looks like.
Right.
Um, and I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. It's not like in my mind very much, but I understand what you're talking about. And then this bigger landscape that you're kind of drawing out for folks in the current book, like it's very like it's which is informed very much by some of these old ways of thinking about the interior life. It's quite familiar. Like, so
Hmm.
some of the categories are different and some of the processes are different. Some of the practices wouldn't some practices do make sense today and some don't make much sense unless you're living a monastic life.
Hmm.
But a lot of it can still resonate, which is quite also reminds us of how human we are across
Hmm.
time and place,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
how similar we are to people that really 2,000 years ago wasn't that long ago in the scope of what it means to be human.
Mm.
We could be just as the advice to let go of your ego as early as and possible,
Mm.
um, and to do it again and again rings true today
Hmm.
just as much as it did then.
Exactly. That the it was even more important when you for people who lived in community as well. Because
Mm,
you get these people coming in, and Evagrius will be the first person to say, what's going to happen among all of you do-gooders, all of you goody two-shoes who are here, is you're going to get good at fasting, or you're going to get good at praying, or you're going to get good at whatever. And then the new one who comes in, you're going to think you're better than that new one who's coming in.
mhm,
And that's maybe you'll show off, that's the vainglory piece, or maybe you'll have pride. And he goes, and then the pride part is where you actually think that you got to your fantastic state all by yourself, you know, and you actually are missing, you actually have this complete misperception, because here you are thinking you're better than somebody else. Like, you have to go
mhm,
back to square one now, because what makes you think you're any better than that other person? Suddenly you're not equal anymore. Suddenly you're, you know, you should be admired, or like, it's just so interesting. He kind of knows what's going to trip up the people who are, the people who are first coming in. They're not going to trip up over something like that, because they're going to be, you know, probably have just been recently sexually active. They're going to miss
mhm,
that. They're going to probably miss drinking and eating good food. They're going to, they're going to miss the things uh, that are pleasure, that gratify your sensual pleasure of your body or whatever. But as you develop and you grow in spiritual maturity, so called, you're going to trip up with other things that are like, and he knows these categories. The categories have never changed. There are 8 afflicting thoughts, but what I found out for this new book is that he actually wrote about a ninth one, and
mm,
it didn't make it into John Cashin's thing, but it did make it into one of the 7 deadly sins. It was with Gregory the Great wrote later, which was envy. Later he says, oh, there's another afflicting thought. Don't let this get you, but envy is going to really come up in communities, especially communities of people who are doing their best. You're trying to improve, and then one person maybe gets some kind of accolade or commendation or attaboy or whatever. And the next thing you'll be like, why did they get that? Why can't I get a break? You know, envy will be right there. And he's like, that's the afflicting thought that's going to torment you. So be ready. And then that's what will harm and damage the community and
Mhm.
get people at each other's throats instead of being a community where people can, you know, be loving and respectful to each other and get along and have, you know, it's supposed to be heaven brought to earth, like an Eden of sorts, you know, but it's not going to be like that if everybody's at each other's throats. Right? He just knew what would trip people up depending on what their issue was, and it's just he's just so clever, and nothing's changed really. You know, like we're saying, like there's these 9 things that he says, and everybody's fallen to them, and some people fall for ones more than others, but it's gonna happen, yeah. And so it's
And
just great stuff.
part of like what's I mean this I only I mean, two pieces kind of I think are important to kind of point out here in what you're saying. Like, and one is like to kind of remind everyone listening that the these afflicting thoughts, as he was writing about them,
Hmm.
do not carry the connotation of punishment that we subsequently associate with like the 7 deadly sins, as that's been kind of
Hmm.
passed down through the
Hmm.
centuries.
Right.
And that this was very much like this is how you navigate your own mind. This is how you
Right.
navigate
Right.
like what shows up inside of yourself when you're trying to do this thing called being on a spiritual journey in a group of with other people, and in
Yes.
this case with a certain set of boundaries set
Hmm.
around it. And
Hmm.
most of us have a certain set of boundaries set around us at any given time. Like, it may not be chastity, but it's going to be something somewhere, right?
Right. Right.
And like
Yeah.
we all have our boundaries. So these what do you how do you work with the parts of the self that show up which struggle with being in community? And right, and I mean we're talking about the interior landscape, but as we said at the
Hmm.
beginning, the interior landscape is constantly intersecting
Hmm.
and feeding off of and shaped, deeply shaped by our collective. So we can't see these as these are the interior and the collective, both physical and spiritual and social landscapes
Right.
are influencing each other and shape shifting each other all the time. So it's
Right.
he's trying to say, like, how do we engage with these different parts of ourselves, including deception, right? And
Hmm.
our ability to the and they're not just emotions. And he talks about them as afflictions, and I think emotions isn't quite the right category for these things. And then
Right.
in your book, you're also but it also feels important because it's like, to kind of look back to those desert fathers and mothers, in the sense that to remind ourselves of the different ways of being religious and spiritual,
Mm.
the different ways of living together in community, the different alternatives to empire that have arisen over time and that people have experimented with.
Absolutely.
Is like whether that be full-time living or as pilgrims, like the different types of expressions, is another reason why it's worth recalling, because we're in a time when there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about. I mean, there's always uncertainty about the future,
Hmm.
and what types of communities might survive and might be able to
Right.
navigate extreme climate chaos and
Hmm.
political and social changes.
Right.
um like surely like no like figuring out both being able to draw inspiration from different places and recognizing these afflictions might be with us there too.
Right. Right.
And then
Yeah.
how do we build the
Hmm.
capacity now?
Right.
Because then you talk about this in your book a fair amount. It's like, as much as, I mean, we can't, trauma comes and goes, but like we don't have a choice all the time. But
Hmm.
when possible, how much can we choose to build our own spiritual practices so that
Hmm.
as things shift and change, and maybe some things get worse and maybe some things get better, we have some practices to engage with.
Hmm. Right. I think, especially in my new book, I'm talking about rule of life. I don't know if you've encountered that term or thought about it at all, but um, a rule of life is like in a monastic community. It's rules and rhythms of work and prayer and uh, eating and all the different things that happen in a typical day. And some of them are practices, but in non-monastic life, you can develop the practices, rules, and rhythms that you want that feed and nurture you. And so I speak about this in the new book too, is about how do you and this is to bring stability, spiritual stability, but emotional and communal and every other way. And it's not to, like the Benedictines have a rule, the Benedictine rule, and it's a specific way the day goes, right? And it doesn't have to be that strict as that your whole day goes a certain way. But for me, like it might mean that there are certain times of the day, like I go outside in my bare feet, except if it's extremely cold, and I have my feet on the actual ground.
Mm.
For I try for 15 minutes at the least. And I remember that I'm part of nature, I'm part of the earth. I don't have to think of myself as um, natural. I am nature.
Mm.
And that's one of my practices. Now that might not sound like close enough to reading my Bible or something, but I also I have prayer of the heart, a silent prayer. I practice the presence, like the presence, like Brother Lawrence did, where you converse with God in the sense that God is there as your friend, where you just share conversation in a sort of normal way that you would a friend because you feel the presence of God. So there's things I do in my day. That's just how I do it. Other people might do like, well, I'm going to spend a devotional time of 20 minutes doing this, our daily bread devotional. That's cool, whatever. And then as you do these practices, maybe you do one or two each day, then maybe one or two each week, and then maybe one a month, and then maybe one a year. Like maybe once a year you go on a retreat. But having this rule of life is something that you can do with yourself or your family or your partner or a small group of people that you kind of engage in that together. I think what you're saying about, not knowing what cataclysms could be in our future, if any, but we might have to think about living communally. We might have to think about sharing things in common more. And we'll have to know how that's worked in the past. We're very individualistic here. And people will do things like hoard toilet paper for themselves. And if people are doing that just for their own comfort, there could be problems with communally sharing things in common. Or like if people are going to stockpile weapons, they're not going to do real well in a communal scenario. So we would have to really reinvent, how do we live together side by side. It's not like it went easy for the monastics. They were having issues too, but there were some things in the rule of life and some things that they had to abide by to commit to living that way. They would, if they wanted to be part of the community, they would knock on the door and they would be refused for 3 or 4 days. You had to really want it. You had to knock on the door, let me in, please. No, go away. It was like Fight Club. I don't know if you've seen Fight Club. He turned down everybody who wants to come.
Well, it's such a classic story too, right? Of like the teacher who turns away students. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to want to be there. And then if you want to be there,
And there's a
and
reason for that, right?
right,
Like
you
yeah.
want to live a certain way, and you'll get the support of you'll get the support. It's not a place for individuals. It's not where you could just go rogue and do whatever you want and throw the rules. It's not, I don't think I'd want to live that way, at least in a monastic desert community. But certain things about living communally, I think, are not just important, but they're imperative. Certain things about sharing certain things in common and being interdependent. Because when we're independent, we're lonely, we are more selfish, we have less empathy, and it's obvious that communities that need each other more out of necessity even, but there's they're more grounded, and less loneliness. There's just much more to say for certain community. Like I saw this when I went to Puerto Rico, and everybody just relies on themselves. And they're like, we can't rely on the government. They're not going to help us. My neighbor, this one, and this one, we share food, and
Mm,
that's how it works. And so, it's those mentalities that sometimes they have to change out of necessity.
mm. And that changes, and that communal sense alters our interior landscape as well.
Exactly. Hmm.
It alters how we think of what we're trying to work with and how we're trying to do it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really cover this too much except for in the one part in the chapter, but there are oppressive systems too, like that that also invade our interior landscape. There's oppressive outside systems. Um, Colonization is one of them too, but there's systematic racism, there's sexism, and there's other ones that can't help but to affect our inner landscape. And I
And
think
how we engage with ourselves, and a lot
exactly.
of what you're doing too is like you have these sort of three chasms, right? Of
Mm,
some ways, these I call them the chasm of unsafety and the chasm of social anxiety and the chasm of control, which are, you're kind of you're borrowing you're kind of running off of some of the work of
hmm.
people like Father Keenan and some other psychological and religious thinking about
Right.
like basic human needs and
Hmm.
basic types of wounds.
Hmm.
Um, and but not just that those things exist and that we can get caught in them and they can
Hmm.
impact us, but there are ways of healing and there are ways of not letting that be the primary thing that drives us. And there
Hmm.
are changing core beliefs and there are ways of um, greater both awareness and shifting of your own behavior
Hmm.
uh, and support our and that intersect with community and intersect with the collective and individual healing
Hmm.
in really powerful and meaningful ways. And that there is also, and I felt like I told you this earlier, that when I was drawing this map, it was inserting all these positive things because I'm like, it looked really scary. Um,
Right.
but
Right.
and like, oh, we had to bring in a little bit of that original blessing here,
Mm.
like that our interior landscapes are also one. And there are chasms of unsafety, but
Hmm.
there's probably also places of very deep, incredible safety and
Right.
places
Right.
of incredible peace
Hmm.
and places of incredible power and places of incredible connection
Yes.
within ourselves as within our relationship to the ecological world and within our relationship to the more than human world as well as to the human world. And we might not find them all the time, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist at all.
To your point, Sarah, I just want to mention that as you talk about remembering and
Mm,
remembrance, this is a good thing if someone does a map or just takes some kind of an inventory. It's so good to know the wounds that are not yet online yet to us and not yet familiar to us there because we're we can't perceive them. But it's also very good to know when in my life have people been there for me? And when have I
mm,
sensed the presence of God or
right,
the provision of God? When have I felt connected and supported? And all the things you have said about safe and well-being and people might find that in nature or they might find that at a concert or wherever that is, that's on their map too. And it is really important to make sure we know that we will just automatically as humans focus more on the threats than we will on the blessings, and
mm,
that in remembering the blessings it gives us a lot more hope and strength to move through the worst times.
mhm. And that's why people are go into the desert too. It's for the blessings, right? It's to live. It's not just to survive, or it's not just to like
Mm,
understand the trauma. It's to live lives of rejoicing.
mm, right, right.
Like I would hope that's
Yeah.
part of why we're on these, why we chose to come here.
Right. For all of the days of fasting, I mean, the ascetics didn't really eat much, but when people came to visit them, they put their fasting aside and they feasted with they gave the best to their guests, and they ate what their guests ate. And, for all the days of fasting in the Christian calendar, if people ever go along with some of those fasting days, there's also feasting days, and every Sunday is a feasting day. And it's important to know that it's not just about deprivation and bad, that there is a lot to luxuriate in a sense, in the blessings, and how rich the natural world is a reflection of this lavishness that we're a part of. We're not part of this deprived, puny, minimal world. We're part of this outrageously luxurious world that is you can see, for me, I can see it most in nature, and you looking at flowers or looking at the design of something and just kind of marveling at not just the design, but the extravagance, I guess.
The delight and the eroticness and the beauty and the wonder, right?
Sensuality of it. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. The tactileness of it, as well as the design, all of it, and the smell and the taste, and we're not here that long on this earth, so to really to find the ways of rejoicing as well as the ways of navigating the fire bogs and the islands of avoidance and the chasms of control. Navigate that stuff as best as we can. So, well, for everyone who's listening, I think we're often, so I know some of you are quite very much into the process of cartography, either literal or figurative, and are asking these questions about how do we navigate, how do we, and that entails and understanding where are we and what are we working with. And so hopefully these are some pieces from both ancient voices and more contemporary expressions that can support that ongoing human question of how do we deal with our internal selves, and how do we deal with each other in a way that can, lead to greater harmony and greater peace. Very much appreciating all, I think one of the things I really appreciate about you, Lisa, is extent to it. You really come at this as a regular person. You're not coming at it as an academic, or although you have done a great deal of study and great deal of research into all of these things, but your capacity to bring it to people just as one person and one seeker speaking to another seeker, something I really appreciate about the way you bring your books and your podcast too. It's very much celebrating that we can all be in the process of seeking together, and I really appreciate that way you have of being with that.
Thank you for saying that. I love how you say that.
So I think I'm sure we'll have more conversations, and thank you so much, and thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summon Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.